Hey guys, Drifter here. I'm back with another video comparing and contrasting the Battlefield and Call of Duty communities. The gameplay you're going to get to see is all Battlefield 6 gameplay from the beta, where I'm PTFOing as hard as I can. Probably not going to have a tremendous amount of kills in this gameplay, but that's okay, because I'm still contributing to the team by playing the objective. And this is the kind of behavior that the Battlefield community wants to reinforce in Call of Duty players. Unfortunately, objective play, and especially selfless objective play, is the exact opposite ethos of the Call of Duty community. Call of Duty's casual players just fundamentally do not play the objective at all, and as a matter of fact, are often playing an entirely different type of game. Side note, this isn't going to be a video that heavily criticizes individuals in the Call of Duty community or even the Call of Duty itself. I'm going to keep the focus on the design elements in Call of Duty that have conditioned people to behave in this way. That's why in my last video, where I encouraged the Battlefield community to take in some of these Call of Duty refugees, a number of Battlefielders went out of their way to point out this trend of ill behavior amongst Call of Duty players. I'm paraphrasing a lot of comments I got on the last video, but they could all be more or less boiled down into three categories. Number one, Call of Duty players do not play the objective, and by corollary, they don't revive teammates. Number two is that Call of Duty players only prioritize kills and streaks of kills. And then finally, number three, a number of Battlefielders pointed out at the reveal event that a lot of popular Call of Duty streamers appeared very clueless. They basically played Battlefield like COD, ignored a ton of the objectives, didn't revive, and the phrase that I saw most frequently was, "I'm not sure if they've ever played any other FPS game," which is probably true. Unfortunately, Call of Duty has broken a lot of people in terms of how they think about gaming. But before we dive into those game design decisions that caused this behavior to be expressed, I wanted to briefly define what I believe the Battlefield community wants from Call of Duty players and why. To put it simply, they want you to just play the objective. The actual in-game strategic objectives that make a difference in winning or losing, like capturing flags, reviving teammates, repairing vehicles, pinging other vehicles or enemy vehicles for laser guidance. There certainly is an objective to kill enemy players. If you run out of tickets, that's one of the key concepts of the game mode, is to get kills and bleed their tickets, and that does help. But Battlefielders don't want that to be the end-all be-all of their game. They don't want that to be the only objective that people are engaging with. Battlefield veterans are more focused on winning the match, or at a minimum having a really high score, which probably indicates some level of OBJ play. And I'm making some assumptions here because I kind of only have my toe in this community, but they probably have these values because Battlefield has always been a team and squad-based game. It allows you, or casual players, to contribute without having to develop a tremendous amount of mechanical skill, like being an aim or movement god in Call of Duty. Playing the objective also drives Battlefielders together en masse so that you really get that big warfare, hectic moment kind of feel when 20 people are fighting over one objective. And it opens up opportunities for really exciting gameplay moments, big wipes, huge streaks, or just impressive tactical play around the objectives. Kind of like how I've been playing the finals recently, because the finals abilities and destruction and all the things going on ultimately conflate into these big, epic action movie moments with the destruction going on and completing an objective in the middle of a hectic gunfight before your building comes down, and it feels like I'm in an action movie. Battlefield has always done a very similar thing, which isn't surprising because the finals is made by a bunch of former Battlefield developers, but Battlefield has always been about getting a lot of people together around an objective, fighting tooth and nail while the buildings around you crumble, tanks are just raining down all sorts of destruction on you, and you have to slog it out through an actual, like, chaotic war movie moment. But the Call of Duty community doesn't necessarily do that in the same way. The games aren't designed to force people to do that, and they're actually designed quite differently, which means they don't have the same set of values that Battlefielders do, because they're getting a different kind of fun out of the game. And again, it's not their fault either, because Call of Duty has discouraged team play for over a decade now. Every single thing that I have experienced since George Bush Jr. was president in Call of Duty has been about individual play and racking up kill streaks. Yes, there are abilities that allow you to scan. Yes, you can revive teammates. Yes, we have specialists. Yes, you can do streaks that are shared. Everybody can see the UAV. But the purpose of those isn't necessarily to encourage team play. The purpose of those is to give you something fun to do while you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off in a casual match. So now we can finally talk about topic number one, which I mentioned almost 5 minutes ago, which is that Call of Duty players do not play the objective. And the number one reason for this is that the base mechanic of Call of Duty is earning kill streaks. Kill streaks are easily the most hype and most fun part of any Call of Duty game, and it's literally the secret sauce that keeps Call of Duty addictive. Just fighting and working hard to earn these big, high dopamine moments of power fantasy is what keeps this franchise going. But the downside of this system is that if you go to capture objectives in Call of Duty, you put yourself at a massively increased risk of dying, which inherently means a decreased chance of getting any kind of fun kill streak in the game. Call of Duty players very quickly and correctly surmised that the proper strategy was to play around the objectives, flank, hide, reposition, rinse and repeat, and get as many kills as possible to get the highest streaks you can. That's just how players responded to a fundamental game design element. Like, why would you capture an objective and get 200 points that contributes to nothing when you can flank around and kill people and get an AC-130 gunship and feel like you're playing a god power fantasy? The issue becomes that if you've played Call of Duty for over a decade, you'll slowly condition yourself to think that this type of playstyle is normal, which is why when X-Defiant came out, and it played very much so like Call of Duty, a huge number of Call of Duty players were insisting the game would have been more fun with kill streaks, but then it would just be Call of Duty. There wouldn't be a reason to play X-Defiant. The developers hoped the objectives would have been more interesting, but they were not. And this type of, I'll call selfish gameplay, for lack of a better word. Please don't take that in a critical way. I mean it more like in a scientific way, like the selfish gene, so to speak. But most FPS games, especially in the modern era, are designed with teamwork in mind and also designed for use of tactical abilities to amplify teamwork. As I mentioned in the previous video, Call of Duty gamers are unique in that they play a lesser variety of games than almost any other gaming community. They're more closely aligned with people that play sports games and only sports games than anything else. So a huge number of these people have spent over a decade, even casually, being conditioned to play selfishly and chase these big streaks. And of course that doesn't translate to Battlefield very well, or honestly to many other games. Number 2 and number 1 flow into each other like peanut butter and jelly, but today's number 2 is that Call of Duty players only chase streaks in other games. I suspect that a great number of casual and even veteran Call of Duty players join other games and feel very alienated by what's going on because it's so different. Why are there all these objectives? Why do they matter so much? Who cares? Why are there all these abilities? Can we not have abilities? They're annoying. How did you bring that bad guy back from the dead? What's going on here? It's somebody else's job to kill the tanks, not mine, right? Like, I haven't carried a launcher in Call of Duty for years, so why am I carrying one in Battlefield? So given all of this bewilderment from players, I think it's very natural for a person to fall back on what they know. The fundamental similarity between the games is that they are military shooters and both have a goal of killing enemies. If the enemies are dead, then your team can take all the objectives that they want, and there is a truth to that. There is a reasonable aspect of that. So COD players kind of get overwhelmed by all this new stuff going on and decide that what they want to do is fall back on the skill sets that they're most familiar with, which is flanking and killing, and they are going to flank and kill until the objectives are ready to be handled by somebody else. And that's mostly what I see Call of Duty players do. Honestly, even I do that sometimes, because as a guy who's been playing Call of Duty for almost 2 decades now, that is a huge flaw of mine in other games. I just have a tendency to fall back and just focus on killing people instead of actually playing the game as intended. There are so many team-based games that I find myself not sticking with the team because I've been conditioned to think that it's a better strategy to flank around my team and pick people off. It also doesn't help that you die super fast in COD, so sometimes sticking next to your team means that you're all going to get wiped together from one guy who's flanking. But I think this is a natural behavior. Players are just relying on what they do understand about FPS games, which will make point number 3 very brief before we move into our conclusion on this video. Call of Duty players at the event, the reveal event, who the community said look like they have never played an FPS game before, have probably played way lesser variety of FPS games than even a casual Battlefielder. Even the content creators in the Call of Duty space spend a disproportionate amount of time only playing that one game. And that's something that's not good or that anybody should be proud of or aspire to, but it is just reality. These guys showed up, weren't super familiar with the type of game they were playing, and just decided to rely on the skills that they were most familiar with, which is chasing kills. But it doesn't have to be that way. Old dogs can learn new tricks. My dog is 15 and a half years old, and I taught him a new trick just last week. Call of Duty players are human beings, which means they are adaptable, trainable, and conditionable. I think the onus actually falls upon the Battlefield community to both protect its own values and to share those values with the incoming Call of Duty refugees. In a video like this, I really wanted to avoid talking about politics because I mix that with gaming way too often. But I've noticed recently that there are microcosms of national level politics occurring inside of video game communities. So the best analogy that I can think of for what could happen with Battlefield 6 is kind of like the Arab Spring and immigration into Europe from the Middle East. The next set of things that I'm going to talk about at the end of this video are at the same time going to be both woke and racist. So I'm probably just going to make everybody mad. So just please have fun projecting all of your anger onto me as long as it makes you feel better at the end of the day. But I would compare the crisis in Call of Duty to the Arab Spring, where people are rebelling against the game and looking to change the game or at least flee to a better game to play. At a minimum, society in the Middle East began to crumble a lot like the Call of Duty community is crumbling right now, and the resulting conflicts forced a lot of people in the Middle East to flee to Europe for their safety, and a vast majority of them ultimately chose to immigrate there because they liked it better in Europe. The leading philosophy at the time was classic liberalism, and with some flavor of we owe it to the world to be the good guys, especially after World War II, and it's a good thing to take in all these refugees, and the diversity will ultimately make our country stronger, probably comparing to like diversity in like Texas and California and Florida in the US and how that actually makes those states stronger. I think that there is value and merit in that philosophy, that variety does build strength, and you do want to be the good guys, and you do want to help people. But unfortunately, a huge amount of the immigrants from the Arab Spring did not assimilate. They did not want to assimilate, they did not try to assimilate, and in many cases, their children actually ended up being more radical than their parents. Populations exploded, the culture and demographics of what you would expect from Europe changed quite rapidly, and to criticize Europe on this in a way that I'm going to get called a hypocrite for because of how much I've complained about the MAGA movement in the US, but well-meaning people in Europe chose not to force their culture onto the new immigrants. There was a huge pushback to downplay crimes of immigrants, to downplay the criminal networks that also got moved over, to downplay the attacks on women, and to downplay pretty much any negative aspect of the immigrant culture that was causing issues in the United States. There were, depending on countries, because every country did it a little different, only limited attempts to teach language, culture, values, law, and other integration type tactics to the new immigrants, because the belief was that it is racist to force or to push your culture onto others. And I can certainly understand that perspective of not wanting to propagate a cultural superiority and just believe that, you know, let's say we'll pick on Germany. The German way is the end all be all best way for everything, and that everything should be the German way and we're going to crush everything. Actually, what a terrible country to pick for an analogy like that. But the decision to be, we'll say, infinitely patient with culture clashes ultimately blew up in their faces really hard, because now Europe is struggling to find a singular social cohesion like they once used to have. I think that Battlefielders are facing a very similar decision with Call of Duty refugees. If they take in a bunch of these new players, then they're sort of facing almost a tragedy of the commons, or a repeat of what happened in Europe, because they're going to face a lot of integration or difficulties with change of values and ethos. I think it's wrong to assume that Battlefield is superior and to demand that they just immediately convert to a religion of Battlefield and do whatever they're told and be a little good community members or whatever. But it's also wrong to just let other people move in and trash the community that you've been cultivating. I wish Hey guys, Drifter here. I'm back with another video comparing and contrasting the Battlefield and Call of Duty communities. The gameplay you're going to get to see is all Battlefield 6 gameplay from the beta, where I'm PTFOing as hard as I can. Probably not going to have a tremendous amount of kills in this gameplay, but that's okay because I'm still contributing to the team by playing the objective. And this is the kind of behavior that the Battlefield community wants to reinforce in Call of Duty players. Unfortunately, objective play, and especially selfless objective play, is the exact opposite ethos of the Call of Duty community. Call of Duty's casual players just fundamentally do not play the objective at all, and as a matter of fact, are often playing an entirely different type of game. Side note, this isn't going to be a video that heavily criticizes individuals in the Call of Duty community or even the Call of Duty itself. I'm going to keep the focus on the design elements in Call of Duty that have conditioned people to behave in this way. That's why in my last video, where I encouraged the Battlefield community to take in some of these Call of Duty refugees, a number of Battlefielders went out of their way to point out this trend of ill behavior amongst Call of Duty players. I'm paraphrasing a lot of comments I got on the last video, but they could all be more or less boiled down into three categories. Number one, Call of Duty players do not play the objective, and by corollary, they don't revive teammates. Number two is that Call of Duty players only prioritize kills and streaks of kills. And then finally, number three, a number of Battlefielders pointed out at the reveal event that a lot of popular Call of Duty streamers appeared very clueless. They basically played Battlefield like COD, ignored a ton of the objectives, didn't revive, and the phrase that I saw most frequently was, "I'm not sure if they've ever played any other FPS game," which is probably true. Unfortunately, Call of Duty has broken a lot of people in terms of how they think about gaming. But before we dive into those game design decisions that cause this behavior to be expressed, I wanted to briefly define what I believe the Battlefield community wants from Call of Duty players and why. To put it simply,